chat there, you're going to be completely in control. You can run a PowerPoint. So if we just go to PowerPoint and start that. Then you go back in here and do screen share. And share that. Right, so if you want to see your face rather than that, you can switch back to there.
I'd rather just look at the slides, to be honest.
Okay. Hopefully everyone in the world can now hear us speaking. If the sound isn't very good, people out there in virtual land, please email us or text us or use the chat function and we'll discover that. So please welcome Lisa Colton, who's going to come and stand over here. So that
I'm going to stand over there. You come out there. So do I have to be in front of the...
Oh, the camera needs to be
Can you have a look at what it is? I don't want them to just be staring down my... Okay. Thanks everyone for coming. It feels a bit odd sort of seeing you when I can see the camera more than I can kind of be aware of you in my vision. So Rupert very kindly offered a slot in the pop music seminar study research group for me to share what I've been doing relatively recently. It was one of the things that I did during my sabbatical leave the second half of 2012. In 2013 I was busy looking after children, and then I came back in 2014, and quite quickly at that point the book came out into print, and I was pleased that this book, edited by Melanie and Martin Iddon, all about Lady Gaga and popular musical culture, came out at that point. It was published by Routledge, and one critic in I think it was a Canadian press called the book "Everything That Is Wrong with Contemporary Musicology Today." So I was very pleased. And his main concern was that it wasn't about Beethoven. So if you come to hear about Beethoven or about standard areas of musicology, then you are in the wrong room. We're going to be looking at something slightly different from a slightly different perspective today. And I appreciate that some of it's slightly off the wall. I was really interested in exploring the relationship between popular music, technology, performance, queer studies, feminism, other isms all at the same time, and this seemed like a good way to do it. All we were asked to do by the editors was to pick a song and think about a different way to explore it. So I decided to investigate telephone. I was not the only author to investigate telephone. There are actually 3 chapters in the book that look at telephone, but we didn't talk to them. So we come up with 3 really different approaches to the song, and my focus is especially related, if you can imagine, knowing me as you do, related to questions of gender, related to questions of a female voice. So I'm presenting this, which is a version of something that's come out of print, but it's also something that I hope to feed into later projects as they come up, and so there, from that point of view, I hope you have a fruitful discussion. And there was time for questions at the end, I believe. Although you've not told me how long you'd like me to speak for, so it's all a bit approximate.
all fine, it's all good.
Right, good. So I've called it Who's Calling? Lady Gaga's Telephone, Female Vocal Empowerment and Signification. And the key terms here really are the notion of power in relation to gender, and secondly the notion of what certain things signify within a popular song, how they relate to other areas of culture. So among the technologies of the past century, the telephone is surely one of the most ubiquitous. One sees it everywhere. It's iconic, even within its constantly developing packaging. Certainly as a small child, we had one that looked exactly like that, technically numbers rather than letters. It's functioned as a transporter of voice for over 100 years and has also featured prominently in popular song. Songs featuring women on the telephone provide paradoxical, performative examples of female vocal empowerment and entrapment. Their voices are contained inside the technology, their bodies primed to pick up the call, their utterances and inner designs amplified and directed with the mouthpiece. If you Google women and telephone, you are looking at the images that can see the sorts of things that come up at the top. It's people looking very bored and anxious, waiting for that phone to ring, probably because it's a chap on the other end who's just, he's just playing it cool for the moment, making a wait. Also, we can think of their utterances, their inner thoughts being potentially amplified and directed and focused through the mouth itself. Do come in, whoever that is. Hello. So that's something. Some people start off. Oh. So this presentation focuses on a genre, if you like, or a corpus of telephone songs, looking especially at the ways in which fictional romantic relationships are governed by or heightened by telephone technology. Lady Gaga's Telephone, which you'll probably know primarily from her album The Fame Monster of 2009, so long ago, serves as a stimulus to explore the history of telephone songs and their relationship with the discourse of female empowerment within popular music. Going beyond the words spoken in the song, I will explore how the presentation of women's telephone voices in song and in music affect the significance of the singer's gestures through their musical presentation in words. As you'll see from your trivia handout, there are well over 100 popular songs that feature telephone technology. What is it about the telephone that has attracted so many commentators in the musical world? The social history and function of the telephone are fundamental to understanding the reasons why performers have returned to telephones in their songs. The telephone is tied to a history that is strongly inflected not only by issues of sex, gender and ethnicity, but all sorts of wider cultural understandings. This developed and initially marketed as a technology to facilitate business transactions between men, a stage in its history in which the advantages of the invention were not immediately embraced as one might have expected. The telephone was emblematic of a culture in which technological mastery was associated with masculinity and the public domain. So once it was invented, it took a while for it to catch on, the telephone, and it was invented primarily to facilitate business, but as we'll see, it was also increasingly possible to use it, or to try to get people to use it, in ways that related to women's lives. So let's think about the early history of telephones. I've read an awful lot about telephones. I'm only going to share some of it today. The gender split here was typical of 19th century culture, in which women's place on the social spectrum was distant from the logic and from the industrial trappings of civilized society, located instead as part of the innocent natural world. However, simply because the telephone was marketed for a particular type of user did not prevent its increasing adoption elsewhere. By the 1920s, telephones had become much more prominent in the home. Although the telephone was now marketed as something to enable women to work within their domestic space more efficiently and safely, for example, avoiding deliveries from men, taking deliveries instead of having to leave the home, so it keeps them within the safe four walls rather than out into the world where they might be kidnapped or something. Women quickly appropriated the telephone for their own purposes, which of course were at that point focused on sociability. So instead of the telephone trapping within the home so they didn't go shopping, they just used them to phone up their mates and arrange social engagement. The telephone may have been invented by Scotsman Alexander Graham Bell in the US, but in the transition from manual to automatic switching systems in America lagged behind the rest of the world. In place of the automation enjoyed in the UK and elsewhere, American Telephone and Telegraph, by far the largest of such companies, continued to rely upon, quote, hundreds of thousands of high school educated middle class young women who served as human telephone switchers. This manual work was in keeping with women's place in business and industry more generally, in which they occupied temporary, low-status, repetitive jobs in production lines or in the office environment. In these scenarios, women were simply part of the technology rather than being in any way empowered by it. Women's hands weren't the mechanisms that produced a range of goods and services, but the economic and power structures that controlled the industry were of course still governed by men. Switch operation was a low-paying activity whose cultural elite was primarily white, even though many black women were employed by the telecom industry. In the early history of the switchboard, young men were employed for their speed and energy. As time progressed, the role became more sedentary, repetitious, and therefore, guess what, well suited in the eyes of society of women. And I've got some archival footage which you can see, which will work. Well, okay, good. Two things playing on the switch. I'm giving it can you give me what is it in it's just me? We don't
Oh, lovely. It's a kind of experimental sound studio. We can turn down your microphone. I can do that actually.
Alright, we're just missing it.
Switching the voice from one line to another was first tried over the wires of a burglar alarm system in Boston in May 1877, a little more than a year after the telephone had transmitted the first complete sentence. The manager of this system put telephone instruments in the offices of 5 of his customers for a few days and connected one with another through switches in his own office. It was over a year after Alexander Graham Bell had begun to demonstrate his switching the voice from one line to another was first tried over the wires of a burglar.
Okay, that's
Sorry, I have to turn your volume back up to do this.
that one.
Still got 4 viewers online.
With a total of 21 subscribers. So
This is a reconstruction, of course, of people when there was just 21 subscribers.
hello, what do you want? 1830 Market, what's your name? And this New York switchboard, the 1879 model, makes clear.
So you can see it's an 1879 model and all lots of active young men.
History tells us that subscribers have difficulty in getting connected. You just expose their right. Now, for the sake of contrast, let's glance at an operating room of today. This is an unusual picture because few operating rooms are long enough. Switchboard of each size to be built without curves or angles.
You can see them all connecting the calls, but they barely have to move. This is a much more appropriate activity for a genteel young lady in need of a little extra income.
This one, for example, could accommodate only a small number of lines, but the first to introduce the key cell.
That's telephone technology. Oh,
You have to screen share.
what's that? Can I not just go to me?
Yes.
I'm going to go to another one.
Okay, well, if you just go to the one that you... I'll just share the screen.
Okay. So anyway, even at this really early stage in telephone's history, musicians are already reflecting on telephones within their songs and often drawing upon that particular type of technology for their songs. For example, you may know Pennsylvania 65000, which is from 1940, which takes its name from the manually switch-operated number of the Hotel Pennsylvania in which the band had performed. The association between women as switchboard operators, sex and the body appeared increasingly in popular song. This is by way of a fairly typical example next. We're going to hear Nick Lowe's Switchboard Susan from 1979, which is basically packed with a whole load of fairly basic innuendos. Susan's number turns out not to be her telephone number, but her bust, waist and hip measurements. 38, 27, 38, and she is praised above all to give for her power to give the singer an extension. So you can kind of imagine.
Good evening. How are you doing out there tonight? All good? Great. It's been a while since we've been in Hamburg. It's been a while since we've been in Germany for that matter, so I think we're going to have some good fun tonight. We're going to carry on now with because you can't dance, of course, can you hear? What we normally use is people dancing, you know, I ain't really used to people sitting down all the time. Still done that, still art. Sweat boxes and won't you give me a line? I need a touch of good line. First time I could tell the telephone, I fell in love with your ringtone. I'm a long distance romancer. Keep on trying till I got an answer. Give my chance to the greatest operator. Sweat spots you let me off the hook. I've been this way since you put me alone. Sweat spots you let me all the rains. I'm a long distance romancer. I keep on trying till I get an answer. I'm gonna give it one more chance to the greatest operator. Oh yes. Let's go. Distance romancer. I keep on trying till I get an answer. Give it one more chance to the greatest operator. It's the funny bit. Well, you girl, I can't understand sound. Don't be really certain where I'm down some action. Sweat spots, Susan, and we be friends. The 6 weekends of a long distance romance.
To get an idea. You can see fairly typically, actually, within the genre, that the something that marks it out, because it's not just a song that mentions the telephone. It's something actually people are talking about the technology. They're also mapping the technology onto women's bodies and their availability, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So in the middle of the 20th century, the telephone as a piece of technology was explicitly gendered. In the 1950s and 60s, the popular media frequently reflected on the tension between a father's control of the home as head of the family and his wife and daughter's use of the telephone to organise social and even romantic engagements. The image of the young women waiting for the phone to ring from a potential suitor was ubiquitous. It was certainly considered very improper for women to make the first move. Women use the telephone differently than men, making longer, more frequent and social calls, or using the phone for contact with others if isolated in rural communities. As with other forms of technology developed in the 19th century, most noticeable the bicycle, social commentators lampooned women's embrace of new contraptions, revealing a fear that unchaperoned women would be unregulated in their movements, behaviours, thoughts and interactions. They might also engage in frivolous activities such as idle talk or gossip. As Julie Wask has argued, who wrote Women and the Machine, Representations from the Spinning Wheel to the Electric Age, she writes, social critics fretted about opportunity to unsupervised romance. They worried too that women and men would take sexual liberties, a theme that occurred often in tales about technologies like the telephone and the telegraph, which had offered new opportunities for courtship and flirtation. Wilson Pickett's 1966 hit entitled 6345789 demonstrates that the perceived causal link between a woman calling her lover and a guaranteed sexual encounter that might follow, underpinned by a chorus ending, all you've got to do is pick up your phone and dial 6345789. Don't got any time for that, but we'll perhaps come back to that at the end if we do. It's a fabulous song, actually. New additions and adaptations to telephone technology in the later part of the 20th century continue to affect the way in which women manage their relationships with men and with one another. The answering machine, intended to prevent important calls from being missed if a woman was, heaven help us, out of the home, was also misused by women to screen calls, enabling the avoidance of certain callers or conversations. A woman's ability was now much more in her control, as she could pretend to be elsewhere. I'm sure nobody here has ever done that. Facilities such as call interrupt or caller display were appropriated in similar ways. So those types of technology that were actually meant to keep women in particularly in the domestic sphere, enabled women to have much more control over their environment. Because if they saw a particular person that was calling, they could just pretend to be out. Although one might expect developments in technologies made during an age of increased emancipation of women to be free from the strictures of gender roles, in fact the weight of cultural history simply tends to translate previous power structures to the new version of each invention. Digital technologies, such as the smartphone, thus have embedded it within them these histories of simple technologies on which assumptions about masculinity and femininity has been formulated, has been argued. And goes on to explain that the mobile phones used by men and women is perceived differently. For men, mobile technology has extended their public sphere work activity into their private domestic space, and for women, the technology has allowed them to take their personal lives with them wherever they go, for example, in staying in contact with young family when at work. The perpetual embedding of previous constructions of gender within new versions of the telephone can be demonstrated readily in the corpus of telephone songs, for which the purpose of this paper I define as any song in which the telephone features a significant component of the lyric. Such songs are, almost without exception, related in some way to romantic relationships, and almost always explicitly from a boy to a girl, less frequently the other way around, and almost never between two men. Exceptions include, as one might expect, Rufus Wainwright's typically ambiguously sexed Vibrate from 2003, in which Wainwright weaves a yearning melody line over a simple ringtone-like bass line with the lyric, "My phone's on vibrate for you," and emphasising the vocal telephonic vibrations by extending the syllable vibrate, of course with his very distinctive vibrato. That's, if you don't know it. Is it going to be alright? This is an outburst statement.
My phone's on vibrate for you. Electro-flashes stereo. As dance spills, I guess I'm getting home. My phone's on vibrate for you. God knows what others never I guess to have fulfilled, still I always my phone's on vibrate for you, but still I never ever fail from no cures now. What won't turn back, but so cold. Call me in the morning, call me in the night. So cold.
See, that was quite a good example, actually, of pared down, where the technology features in the song, partly because the bass line sounds like a kind of Nokia monophonic ringtone, and partly because obviously he's talking about technology itself. Since the advent of the music video, artists have had additional scope to enhance the listener's viewers' understanding of the song's meaning and context by showing the telephone in use. Occasionally, a live performance will offer the opportunity to position the song in relation to communication about technology. Although a significant proportion of social interaction in the digital age takes place online, through social media sites, texting, instant messaging, the telephone remains unrivaled in terms of the number of songs that focus on, for example, email or social media. Anybody ever heard Britney Spears' Email My Heart? It's a terrible song, and I don't know many songs about email, and there's probably a very good reason for that. It's not terribly romantic. Arguably then, it's partly because the cultural assumptions about particular types of technology differ. And in the 20th century, in some ways, the telephone has replaced letter-based correspondence as that place where romantic communication relationships are built, whether that's through texting or through phone conversations. So songs that feature the telephone can actually be read as a metaphor for very deep levels of intimacy between men and women in particular, and often hint at the promise of sexual encounter. So I want to move here to think about constructions of gender and power in telephone songs. I've had enough telephone technology. If, as social historian Claude Fisher and others have argued, the telephone itself has been appropriated from its origins as masculine technology, the transition has not resulted in an alternative, balanced relationship between gender and technology. Instead, the telephone continues to act as a locus for anxiety about female empowerment. The telephone number itself, as a gateway between a male caller and a usually female recipient, is a common trope of telephone songs. A woman's phone number is her own property, hers to make available for a chosen male partner at an early part of their courtship. As a result, the telephone number is a potent metaphor for her availability, and indeed the availability also of her body to the advances of her lover. Common perceptions about power dynamics and relating to women and the telephone can be demonstrated in two contrasting songs from the late 1970s and 80s. Mary Wilson's novelty hit Telephone Man from 1977, which reached an amazing number 6 in the UK charts and number 18 in the US, and Kraftwerk's The Telephone Call, which is entirely different, and it was a single released in the 1986 album Electric Cafe, which topped the Billboard Dance Chart in 1987. I was also going to play you Cyndi Lauper's Girls Just Want to Have Fun. We'll do that another day. These examples have been chosen in part because of the way in which each deals with the relationship between the telephone and women, and also because Lady Gaga's own work would appear to reference music from this era quite strongly, not least in terms of the synthesised pop sound embraced by artists. So our first example is Mary Wilson's Telephone Man. Anybody here not heard this song? Marvellous. Okay, you're in for a treat. You know it though, don't you?
I've got something.
Yeah, have you? Wonderful. So Telephone Man narrates the story of a lone, innocent female, who requires a new telephone to be wired. Inviting the engineer to her property, she squeals with joy at the information that she can have it, the phone, but in a not so subtle innuendo, also sex, on the landing, in the hall, in the bedroom, or indeed against the wall. This song is exceptional in Wilson's double voicing. So she does all the voices. She does both the voices, her own voice, and also she mimics or imitates an engineer. The engineer's voice is low in register and clearly an impersonation of a sexually experienced, predatory older man ready to take advantage. And the engineer's voice features in the chorus, privileging his position of control in the song and of the situation. By contrast, her female voice is declaimed in a childish squeak, interjected by nonsense words that one might expect of a very young girl. Furthermore, the jazzy accompaniment with limited scoring in the treble register emphasises the bass line and creates a gulf in pitch that makes Wilson's girly squeaks even more pronounced. Mary's female character is portrayed as vulnerable, but also as a kind of naive and willingly corrupted virgin, something that I've explored in relation to medieval motets about nuns who are singing about sex in the 13th century, if anyone wants to read that. And in many ways, Telephone Man plays up to traditional stereotypes about women and technology, as well as exemplifying prejudicial views of the 1970s about women's role as sexually available and confined to the home. Indeed, humour of the period frequently collapsed these aspects together. So I'm going to play this. Can you just connect me up and then...
I went to my apartment on Monday at 1, singing la chicky-bum. Started moving in it on Tuesday at 2, singing la chicky-do. Wednesday at 3, I called the phone company, singing, hey baby, put a song in for me. Thursday at 4, he came and knocking at my door, singing, hey baby, on the telephone man, you show me where you want it, and I'll put it where again. I can put it in the bedroom, I can put it in the hall, I can put it in the bathroom, I can hang it on the wall. You can have it with the bush, you can have it with the ring, and if you really want it, you can have a ding-a-ling, because hey baby, on the telephone man. I'll play that, and then he says, no one of the fellas call you, tell them how it all began. Well, I heard began to thump again, my mind began to fly again. I knew I wasn't dealing with no ordinary guy. So while he was talking, I was thinking of my plan. Then my finger did the walking on the telephone man, singing, hey lolly, hey lolly, hey lolly, get it any way you can, right? So I got it in the bedroom, and I got it in the hall, I got it in the bathroom, and I hung it on the wall. I got it with the buzz, and I got it with the ring, and when you told me what my number was, I got a ding-a-ling, and singing, hey lolly, hey lolly, hey lolly, do you not think?
Do you feel culturally enriched? Don't need to say much more about that. It largely speaks for itself. But in terms of exemplifying the relationship between women, technology, telephones, and song, that's fairly clear, isn't it? Sorry, I'm going to be playing Kraftwerk soon as well, so just leave it. Okay. By complete and utter contrast, Kraftwerk's The Telephone Call is crafted from sampled songs from a telephone. This sampling and manipulation is very obvious to the listener and includes a pretend automated female voice announcing that the number dialed has been disconnected, as well as the sound of automatic redialing. And it's a shame Jeff Cox isn't here, because he's got a piece that features disconnected women's voices, hasn't he? The number you have called has not been recognised. As an album, Electric Cafe, which was re-released in 2009, was the first Kraftwerk LP to be largely crafted from digital technologies. In line with Kraftwerk's aesthetic, in which technology and the human are closely intertwined, the telephone functions both as a piece of technology and as a mechanism whose raison d'etre, namely the communication between human beings, is rendered impotent by both the lack of interest shown by the recipient of call and by the lack of engagement in conversation with the caller. Lyrically, the song is very one-sided, and this is emphasised by the accompanying video that shows members of Kraftwerk making calls to hear a voice and then remaining entirely silent. This is, well, it's pretty creepy actually. And this sinister setup reflects the standard social dynamics of phone calls since the early 1900s, where men were active callers of women in setting up romantic liaisons, and women waited by the phone passively. It also explores the power relationship of nuisance callers, in which women feel vulnerable when unwanted and unsolicited calls are made by a man who knows her home number, and often remains silent on the line. The musicians here then occupy an ambiguous social space, as their use of telephones, phone directories, and eventually a typewriter evoke a one-sided sexual pursuit that is also attractive to callers of sex chat lines. By cutting off the recorded voice at the close of the song, Kraftwerk retain the upper hand. So I don't know if you've seen this, but it's a pretty sinister. So let's think then about freedom and the voicing of technology in Lady Gaga's telephone. Sorry, do you need to listen? So the theme of freedom, physical, emotional, sexual freedom, and is fundamental to telephone, and is immediately signposted in the opening shots of the song, in which we see a sort of prison scene. The telephone video was designed as a sequel to Paparazzi, in which Gaga's character took murderous revenge on her violent lover who had pushed her from a balcony. Telephone picks up the story from Gaga's incarceration, and she's led into the prison and greeted with enthusiasm by fellow sexy female prisoners. After being thrown into a cell by a pair of butch prison officers, the scene cuts to a prison yard in which Gaga enters wearing sunglasses covered in lit cigarettes, signifying her power through the common use of cigarettes as currency within the prison system. Sitting down, she's immediately joined by a further butch lesbian dressed in black leather who kisses her seductively, an announcement that Gaga has a phone call to answer is ignored. After a fight between the two other inmates in the prison, Gaga is called again to the phone, which rings as a musical intro is finally heard. The depiction of the phone call is initially diegetic, as the call is to indicate that Beyoncé has posted her bail. Yet it is also unsettling, as the lyrics, which refer to Gaga ignoring her lover because she's busy socialising in the club, do not match the film's setting. Furthermore, there's a further dissonance between the lyric implying the lover's signal is breaking up and the use of distortion and manipulation in Gaga's own voice to create a shuddering sound on words like what did you say, as the line apparently fails. Indeed, the repetition and failing of individual syllables or words is a really strong feature of the song and its chorus, in which the word me is extended with short, punctuated, repeated syllables. And Beyoncé's lines are also delivered on exactly the same pitch. The vocal stuttering mimics the ringing of a telephone, a feature emphasised by the underpinning chorus, whose melody is largely delivered on one note with rapid delivery of lyrics, which with sounds sampled from technologies themselves, notably a caller-busy sound and a dial tone. Telephone also explores something of a queer space, not only through the song itself, but also its collaboration with co-writer Beyoncé, and through the video's various references to empowering road movie Thelma and Louise and its pervading subtext. The metaphor of the prison or other enclosed space is not unusual in media to explore the queer female body within the male gaze of the visual media, and the first scenes of Telephone recall the barbed wire fencing trapping the pseudo-lesbian Russian singer's tattoo from their voyeurs in their 2002 hit All the Things She Said. If Gaga and Beyoncé can be seen as something of a queer pairing in narrative terms, this is compounded by their visually contrasting ethnic identity, and orally by merging their usually very highly distinctive styles. While Gaga's image betrays her Italian-European heritage, Beyoncé's ethnicity has been the focus of frequent critique by the media and her fans, who have queried the extent of her blackness. So how are the singers presented orally? Within the single release of Telephone, Beyoncé's contribution arrives relatively unexpectedly, only about a minute and a half into the song. Excuse me. There are some commonalities between the musical material assigned to each of the women, notably the really relentless four-chord harmonic palette, F minor, A flat major, B flat major, and then back to F minor. Both singers concentrate their melodies around repeated notes, giving a sense of their combined role within the song. Melodically and rhythmically, then, the character of the song has the feeling of simple ringtone, with its restrictive musical gestures acting as a nagging reminder of incoming call that Gaga and Beyoncé are trying so hard to ignore. Just sort of skipping a few bits to have a look at some point. The use of sampled phone sounds is absolutely commonplace within telephone songs in general. Beyond direct samples, the voices of Gaga and Beyoncé are treated to electronic manipulations that make them stutter, akin to the buzzing and the ringing of telephones. And this happens throughout the song, and is also mirrored in the video by syncing the film to the music to give a visual stammer in several places, as well as some telephone-related poses and telephone-related dances. The bridge, for example, with its repeated monotonous patterns on the symbol air, mirrors this particular effect. And in this way, you can see that the singers are sort of becoming part of the technology, the way that their voices work, the way that they're dancing, and the way in which their voices are manipulated to sound like telephone technology. So let's have a little look at this. It's a sort of 9-minute thing, so we might have to watch the very opening and then fast forward a little bit. So listen out for stuttering and ringtones and samples.
You'll be back, honey. You've been a very bad girl. A very, very bad, bad girl, Gaga.
Baby. Sure you want to do this, honeybee?
What do you mean, am I sure?
You know what they say. Once you kill a cow, you gotta make a burger.
You know, Gaga, trust is like a mirror. You can fix it if it's broken.
But you can still see the crack in that mother reflection.
This is Radio KUK. This is Lady Gaga breaking out like Alpha.
Gonna make you feel when I'm not home, baby, it don't faster. Put my coat on faster. Leave my girl on faster. I should've left my phone at home, 'cause this is such a disaster. Just a letter. Sorry, I did not answer.
So, do you want to, does it need to go back again? There are so many things one can say about the music, in more detail, have we more time. In sort of summary really then, through situating telephone in the cultural history of women's vocality in relation to technology and gender, it's possible to see the song as both typifying tropes of genre and acting to destabilise some of those features. Telephone problematises the concept of passive or willing female recipient of male attention, instead offering a characterisation in which Gaga constantly ignores the technology to engage in social activities within the public domain, such as dancing in the lyrics, or spending time with marginalised female companions who include criminals, black women and lesbians. The very technology that enslaved women as human switchers in the early part of the 20th century, or as passive hangers on the telephone in the 20th century, is represented as blocking those lines of communication through poor reception and Gaga's manipulation of it. Stuttering distortions of Gaga and Beyonce's voices allied their bodies with the telephone itself. By the final section of Telephone in the video, it's clear that the women are united in their gestures, music and all-American costumes, although they have resorted to violence to gain control over their personal space in a male-dominated, technologically driven world. Cultural expectations for women and non-white black women in relation to each other are therefore disrupted. Gaga's and Beyonce's voices are delivered to an absent, unlistening object, rather than being forced to respond through the mobile technology available to them. Paradoxically, the listener becomes that object through the mapping of the telephone onto the microphone or sound recording technology that arguably occurs during telephone songs. In a number of ways, then, Telephone offers a surprisingly rich exemplar of Gaga's embracing of the politics of diversity, equality, and empowerment. Thank you very much. Go and watch Telephone.
Have we got any questions for anyone?
I'm still none the wiser about how this works.
Question?
If you have further questions, however, and you would like to take these questions to the pub, you're very welcome to join me in the pub, where I'll be going quite soon.
I'm just trying to get the lovely video up. stop screen sharing.
Why do you want a video of my face?
Victor said that the 3 viewers out there, hello 3 viewers out there in rest of the web world. There we have 3 people who've watched the presentation.
Thank you for bearing with us.
If you have any questions from online, then we can see your questions. You can press the question button in Google Hangout. How do you see this particular song tying in with the rest of Gaga's outputs? I mean, earlier is quite similar to this, but more recently she's kind of changed her approach.
Yeah, and I have to say I'm slightly more interested in what she was doing in that earlier period of music than what has happened subsequently, which seems much more driven by iconography and by trying to make a bigger cultural statement, taking on religion, taking on things that are less focused on musical experimentation than they are necessarily fashion and of course, actually, what I think she does really impressively here and in things like paparazzi, bring many of those together in an ambitious and cohesive way. And I think this song, although it doesn't really sound, it has much of a connection to paparazzi in many senses, is its sequel, and it's quite interesting to kind of the background about how those songs relate. Yes, I guess that's where I am with it. I think that there hasn't been a shift in a big way music to that particular album. The surrounding apparatus that kind of goes around with Gaga has become stronger and more powerful, and the extent to which she is directly responsible for some of those changes becomes a little bit more ambiguous. Whereas to begin with, it's clear that she had a fair technological and artistic control over what she was making, and was also working in collaboration with people who really understood the ways in which she manipulated those different references to previous cultural context.
Because her early music seems to be a lot about technology, and paparazzi is really about technology. The music is very technological, and it seems to be about technology and the body and her place in society as a woman is a big part of what she does.
Yes, and I mean also technology in terms of the relationship between technology and the body, and the metallic bodysuit that she gets out of the car wearing in order to kind of, she falls off she was pushed, so she gets pushed off the balcony, and then amazingly through the body cast she's able to step forward. And then, of course, eventually it comes down to that farmer coming away. But so technology in terms of video, in terms of sampling, it's types of technology, in terms of clothing, John.
I was just wondering what you think relationship is kind of empowering statements about telephone technology relationship and nakedness.
Yeah, good question. And not just nakedness, but particularly early on in the song, a direct reference to the wild press speculation that actually she had a penis, which is what they sort of refer to in the prison scene, where the butch prison officers say, "I told you she didn't have a penis." There's a line of feminism that says one can be empowered by one's choice to be naked. And I think she deliberately plays with the gaze that she knows is associated with popular culture. Whether she's always that's always an empowering thing, I personally feel it's not as clear cut as she might claim. In the same way that you can see claims of independence and empowerment in relation to choice of clothing comes from Beyonce and the way that she presents herself, the way she represents. So I think it's more problematic than it looks, but I do think that she reminds me a little bit of Dolly Parton who is self-conscious in her femininity. I don't mean like self-conscious in a kind of hiding away, but actually she's very conscious of how she presents as an exaggerated form of woman. Even though she's not a curvy woman, she actually uses the heels and the quite elaborate clothing to draw attention to the traditional markers of sexuality. So it's quite a complicated, that we might take on. Which I feel particularly empowered by. Like this. Something.
And that kind of raises the issue, because there's also something else going on here, which is there's Beyonce and black African American culture, and Lady Gaga, who is kind of white culture, but also perhaps Jewish culture. But anyway, white, and there's certainly white and black going on here.
Yes, and the relationship between sort of classical training of Lady Gaga, maybe against assumptions about more natural forces amongst black culture, that assumption about the real, although of course Lady Gaga also does up classical training. And I think the choice of Beyonce gets a credit for the song, but the song was actually written initially for Britney Spears. So it's clearly come a long way by the time it gets to being a duet between Gaga and Beyonce, and I think that makes it interesting in itself. Can you imagine this song being sung by Britney? It wouldn't be this. It would be much closer to Email My Heart, unfortunately, which would be a shame. I had to listen to a lot of terrible songs, and I've inflicted very few of them.
Okay, well, we're running out of time on our Google Hangout timetable. So I think we'll go to anyone who wants to come for a drink. We'll give ourselves a couple of minutes to go and have a thing and me for you.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Liz.